Good morning, everyone. I would just like to announce that you will be able to submit questions throughout the conversation we have today. Chat has been disabled, but the Q&A will be answered following our discussion. This is recorded and will be available on the Mass website and the YouTube channel for sharing. So I am Amber Hanover. I'm the community engagement lead here at the Museums Association of Saskatchewan. I would like to begin by welcoming Elder Sid Fiddler of Waterhen Lake Cree First Nation, who is joining us today from the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society office in Saskatoon. I would like to thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge, and I am deeply honored that you can be with us here today. I am coming to you today from Regina, which is located on Treaty 4 territory. Mass's work and support reaches lands covered by Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, currently known as the province of Saskatchewan, comprised of the territories of the Nehiyawak, Anishinabeg, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Métis, and Nakota nations. We are committed to focusing on repairing the relationships between immigrant Canadians who have settled here over centuries and the First Nations people who have walked these lands since time immemorial. We commit our roles in nurturing meaningful relationships and building understanding, and we dedicate our efforts to working together in a spirit of collaboration and reconciliation. We are all treaty people. I want to welcome everybody here today to today's community chat. We're here to join museum folks from across the province for an online personal development opportunity, a chance to network with other museums, to chat, ask questions, and seek advice. Again, as I said, this is the first format we've done in kind of a webinar, but I'm pleased to have Elder Sid Fiddler here to discuss how museums in Saskatchewan can make their spaces more welcoming to Indigenous people. And he is here to share suggestions on how we can make our museum spaces more welcoming and inclusive. If you're ready, Elder Sid Fiddler, I'll pass it over to you.
I know most of you don't know Cree, so I'm going to talk English for the presentation. First of all, I just sent greetings to all of you that are listening into this webinar. I didn't expect to be speaking about this particular topic, but here I am at the Sask Archaeological Society office in Saskatoon, and it reminded me of participating in a archaeological site visit west of Harris, Saskatchewan, and I drove about 4 elders that were working with the Saskatchewan Indian Cultural Center, and that was in the late 70s. We toured the site. It was a site that had turtle effigies, teepee rings, a vision quest, and what appeared to be circles. And the elders said that the ceremonies that were performed there were horse dances, and other ceremonies that they used to participate in that particular site. They normally they talk to the archaeologist, but on the side they talk to Cree to myself, so that I'll be able to understand how to understand those archaeological sites and what their meanings were from their perspective, from the Indigenous perspective. So that was my first time that I've ever attended a archaeological site, and it was very. It's left a mark on me in terms of the benefit and the significance of it. You know, it was the start of really introducing, in my opinion, an Indigenous perspective in archaeological sites. To be able to not to speculate as to what the significance and the meaning may be, but to more closely indicate what and how they used to see it and how it applies thousands of years ago. You also, because in the 70s, I was just recently starting to be orientated into the Indigenous ways, knowledge, systems, worldview. It was a little early in my time to be able to fully understand it. After maybe 40 years of being immersed in it, I begin to understand what that worldview is, how it's interrelated, how it becomes interconnected, and what possibly now I better understand what some of the significance of these archaeological sites and what they do have to offer, particularly with the back to the land education that is part of the curriculum for Saskatchewan. I'd like to maybe begin to talk about, again, reconciliation. We've had a long history of really some negative genocidal impacts in our contact and in the way we've been impacted by the colonial systems of Indigenous people. As a result of those, as a result of the impact, it has really drastically affected us intergenerationally, into our children, our grandchildren today, our great-grandchildren. And we are at a point where we want to change the way we understand ourselves as Indigenous people, from the way that we were taught to understand ourselves from a colonial perspective. I find that the colonial perspective is one quite slanted towards a Christian perspective, as being the way. The other thing about it is that it has some very negative views towards Indigenous people and practices, paganism, savages, or worshiping the devil, those type of things that a lot of us were taught in the institutions they call residential schools. My parents, my grandparents went to those schools as well, and they were taught from that perspective. So when we were institutionalized into this perspective, that was the way that we come to understand what being Indigenous is about, and that there was nothing really relevant or appropriate or applicable to kind of a contemporary life that it had offered. As a result, as a result, a lot of us, including a lot of us, got the same mainstream education and that indoctrination, so that we were taught to look on indigenousness as negativeness, and we didn't want to have really little to do with identifying or becoming part of that. In the 70s and 80s, there was the beginning of the involvement and participation of elders in the education system. They started to come into our classrooms at the university level to begin to talk about neo-matsu. What does it mean? What is neo-matsu? How do we begin to look at it? What does it mean? What is the history? What is the symbolism? So they begin to almost do an orientation on us as part of that, as part of our training and education. And it was the first time that we really had that we begin to understand ourselves in a whole different way, a positive way, than we've been taught. So with that education and that training, it got us into, and it got some of us to seek it out further and go into the education teaching of that knowledge systems through ceremonies and the prayers and the rituals that were there. And so that was our learning, the learning path that was offered to us. And then going into those learning paths, you learn the songs and you learn the prayers and the rituals and all that goes along with that way of looking at it. After about 30 years of being immersed into that way of being, now I'm at a point where all those elders that taught me have passed on, and I am in the position now to become an elder to those new generations that are following me. And I have to, it's a big responsibility. It's redoing the impacts of genocide that's been imposed on us, and trying to turn things around in our community, because it has had a very drastic impact on our indigenous people. So we know, how do we look on ourselves as indigenous? What does it mean? How could you use that to promote healing, wellness? How do you use that in the way people, our own people, look at their identity, their self-concept of who they are, and begin to use it as a healing recovery tool that is required in First Nations community. And so we're at that point now that we're beginning to go public, like using webinar, to be able to use that medium as a way to reach out to not only our own Indigenous people, but to non-Indigenous people, so that they begin to understand what that is about. in the archaeological, looking at archaeological sites. Now, I know that those sites, some of those sites are a little bit more common. For example, over here, we've got the site just at the outskirts of Saskatchewan. I forgot what it's called.
Yes.
What?
Ancient deckles.
Yeah.
Is that the way you want to see?
Scaling, yes. I was just thinking, what is, what is scaling? Okay. Everybody knows what is scaling. So one of the elders said, "Wanaski, that's what it is. Wanaski, is to turn things around from becoming lost or not forgetting about what the Indigenous people were given by the Creator thousands of years ago. We've been given a way, a language, and culture, how to live interconnectedness and interrelatedness with one another, with all beings in Mother Earth. And we follow that way of being. And sometimes over the past thousands of years, we've lost sight of that. And the time that we have turned it back, you want to skate on. It's like we recovered. It's like turning over the sod again to recover what the original intent was. They predicted long time ago that we would be hitting that in this as a fourth time. And now that's what Wanaski is. This is the fourth time that we've done it in a 1,000-year history to recover back that way of seeing and looking things that were given to us by the Creator. So to us, that's what is reconciliation. To recover that, reconcile with it, and to be able to use that again in the way we treat one another, in the way we govern ourselves, in the way that we relate to non-Indigenous people. So it's important that we do it in a good way. We do it with trust. We do it with integrity. We do it with honesty. I'm reminded of the Anishinaabe elder that told me that in 1763, when King George had the Royal Proclamation of 1763, there was 4 individual Anishinaabe that went to live with him in the palace. And they had daily consultations with the king. And over the 4 months led up to the development of the Royal Proclamation, that is the basis of relationship between the Crown and Indigenous nations. And that relationship is one of the Crown's assumption of sovereignty and control, ownership over the land and the resources, over the Indigenous ownership of land, resources, and their sovereignty. And that relationship, is the basis of that relationship that exists And it is that going back to about 250 years, that we're now at a point which we can attempt to do it in a good way. It's I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm just saying it's going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging, but we're at a point where the receptiveness of mainstream institutions to that new way of doing things is starting to be there. So looking at the sacred sites then with the Archaeological Society and the museums, there's a few things that we can do from my perspective. One is sacred sites. To us, they continue to be sacred sites, some of them, sacred sites, where we go visit and they say, you know, it will me gusto. It might so no. The things that they go into the site to help them in their personal lives and their struggles, to continue on with integrity, with strength, with knowing how to proceed in that good way, in the challenges that they are encountering in their lives. So those sites become that way to contemplate that, to contemplate what is, how do I get in touch with it? How do you get the spirit guides to help me to be able to do it in the way that I was intended to do. So these archaeological sites continue to be sacred sites. We're put on these places called Indian reserves that are set aside, crown land and title that set aside reserve for Indians. We don't even own title to the land. We don't even own it, have ownership of the land. It's still crown land. We need to change things around because our understanding is that it's our land. We should have full ownership. The sites that are in our traditional territories have to be, we didn't give that up. We continue to use them for hunting, fishing, trapping, the lifestyle that we've had, as well as, medicine gathering, as well as sacred sites to go and continue on the perpetuation of the covenant that was there from thousands of years ago, the Creator to the Indigenous nations. We have to honor that, and we have responsibilities to continue on that way for our younger people and into the future, because we've got immense work to do in that area. We've got in a lot of these sites, it would then be good if we're part of that reconciliation process to waiver the fees here, that the waiver the fees for Indigenous people, because we're coming there for a different purpose. We're not tourists. We're not. We don't want to know about some past Indigenous sites and that type of knowledge. We were going to want, what happened here? Why is it important today? Why is it important? What is important to you? What does this mean? In our perspective, and having it being able to be interpreted in the original language would be very helpful. So fees, we're not there. Fees ought to be waived, for Indigenous people, as part of the reconciliation process. Extending an invitation to the Indigenous schools, to do school visits, to do sites would be a good thing to begin to do, because to let them know of the relevance of it, because a lot of our administrators, managers are unaware that the sites exist, and so there needs to be some type of marketing aimed towards Indigenous schools to get them to make a site visit. That's part of their land-based education. That would be a very good thing to do. It would also be good if we begin to have elders, that you can have Indigenous elders that you can call on to do kind of that land-based education and training, so that we're able to be on the same page, that same way of looking at it, so that if they're being used for people of their own tribal group or their community area, they're able to give that perspective of what those different archaeological sites, what is there, and what it means to them in their community, and looking at their history, any stories associated with those sites. We have sometimes ceremonies that are part of the visit. We do those ceremonies because they're in recovering our ceremonies. We use them in those particular sites to remind us of how relevant it is. It was in the past, the present, and how relevant it will be for future as well. So the ceremonies, they provide that way of doing things. They also provide knowledge and teachings about an Indigenous worldview that would be useful not only to Indigenous people, but to non-Indigenous people, because we all have a very, very challenging job of undoing a lot of the stereotypes, racist attitudes, a very ethnocentric perspective in the way we do things. So we need to be able to begin to deal with those and dispel and challenge and put in a different way of being and working together in partnership. It would be good as well in those archaeological sites to consider even summer employment of having our own Indigenous student guides to go in there and train them under our elders, so that they're able then to better assess what those archaeological, what they may be, and their meaning, their significance, a little bit more closer than archaeological speculations, in my opinion. So training training of Indigenous people, students, even the elders that you have for the different archaeological sites, even having becoming part of how we do things in the partnership way, in a different way, is going to have immense benefit. It also gives us a chance to be able to, every time I go into an archaeological, I see the first time, I get an insight. 10 years later, I go back, and 10 years is a long time to get additional experience and insights that all of a sudden you go in there again for the second time. And it opens doors up. By the time you get in there the third and fourth time, after 40 years, 50 years, you're able then to, if you live long enough, to be able to begin to put them together and understand a little bit more closely what those sites may mean, and how importantly they are as part of our reconciliation process. For museums, I just want to mention that we're at the beginning of looking at repatriation of sacred objects and things that have been put into museums over the last 100 years. And some of our communities are looking at how do we begin to repatriate some of those objects that are currently in the museums, in the basement of our museums. How can we get them? Because we also need to be able to have some tangible way of teaching our history. We have to have those objects that are, some of them that are in the museums, that need to be activated. And those are pipes, maybe, that we're able to activate once a year to bring them to life again, because that's what they were meant for. And it's women's pipes, male pipes, so those type of things are those families in which those pipes have ownership of those ones. They have to activate them in the ceremony to bring it's part of our reconciliation process that we need to enact in part of the healing recovery that I was talking about earlier. We need to be able to provide training and education, for staff, for management, as to what is repatriation, what does it mean for the different objects that they do have, how could we best do it, how could they best aid us to prepare us, to have the right facilities within maybe our schools in our community to have those objects displayed in a way that's safe and doesn't reduce the quality of the objects that are old. We do it in a way that meets those standards and standards that are currently there. And I think that we're then in a better position then to begin the process of repatriation of those objects as part of our reconciliation period. We also need to, how do we get, what kind of repatriation ceremonies are appropriate or relevant within the communities that are there. Perhaps they may be traditional, they may as well be a community that is kind of more right-wing Christian evangelistic community. So it would help to have people that understand the communities and where they are and what type of ceremonies that would be appropriate or relevant to that particular community should they want to repatriate those objects and how to best do it. We have issues with, for example, say pretend Indians and people that think they know, put themselves in as experts in being a medicine man, say for example, for Indians, for indigenous people. We want to avoid people using those individuals, and we begin to look at getting the involvement of those elders and cultural leaders that are seen as legitimate, and have that particular knowledge and will be sanctioned by the community in the repatriation ceremony. That if the community is going into that way of doing things. So it would help as well than the museums. And I know that I know of some indigenous people that have begun to be employed because it's going to be some of the directions and specialized knowledge that is going to become much more common to have indigenous people leading that partnership when we have the museum institutions. Those are some of the areas that I just wanted to talk about that I thought was relevant to this webinar today, and I will open it up for questions now.
I want to thank you again for sharing your knowledge and experience so openly with us today. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? You're welcome to type in the Q&A. And I will pass those along. While we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions at all, we just want to state that Mass recognizes the roles of museums in perpetuating colonial practices in Canada, both directly and indirectly through collection and display practices, policy, and even harmful rhetoric. So we do believe that there are attainable goals that we can all achieve. Even, this summer. And we are here to support our members through this work of reconciliation. So please reach out to us for more information. We have resources to share with you. So we just have a few thank yous here. And we do have a question just about that community kind of engagement, involvement with an elder in their area, and the approach if you know, in your experience, you would recommend for an institution to possibly approach a community, or I'm not sure if you can speak on that.
It's the question is, how do you engage the community? And the elders has to letting them know about archaeological sites and what the museums are prepared to do. Is that what I'm trying
Sorry.
to.
No, that's okay. I think the question is just more in how to approach a community in starting that conversation with finding an elder that could possibly help in their institution.
Same way as any place. You start out with a phone call.
Yeah.
And you ask,
Yeah, conversation, community conversation. Yeah,
they'll direct you.
Yeah.
They'll direct you to
that's
the
awesome.
people, an elder, to do it. Yeah.
We do have another question, if you have some insight here about what your thoughts about how local museums could support Indigenous nations that would like to create their own museums and cultural centers.
Well, the only one that I know is the one in Homemaker. It's a small museum. Yeah. Specializing in localized cut knife, rattle a cut knife hill, and as well looking at the what happened in the 1885. It's called the Northwest Rebellion. You know, don't even see it as a rebellion. It's much more an assertion of our right to be independent and maintain our sovereignty.
Yeah, and I think you spoke on that a bit too, in how the support in your own schools and education and teachers and management and institutions, that support from the museums with acknowledging and just being open to share, you know, these sites and objects, whatever it happens to be, and that, you know, working together so that education is shared across the board, not just on the museum or site level or who's presenting that site as what it is. So
I think the museums are doing, you know, a huge turnaround from the time that I first attended some of these museums back in the early 70s, when it is totally non-Indigenous managed and controlled with that perspective. You know, since that time, they started to introduce a indigenous perspective in the way they display things, you know, and I see that started as being very useful because uh, you know, we need to dispel a lot of the colonial misconceptions really about what indigenous is. And it's only by doing that we're able then to confront them and come up with something that we're able then to interpret them together in partnership. And I think that is the way that we have to do it. I'll tell you a funny story. Okay, this is a funny story. In the early 70s, I was bar hopping, looking for somebody to buy me some beer, and I was with two other guys, and we went into the bar with only enough money to buy one beer apiece. And we were sitting there thinking, well, I hope we know somebody that come in so that we're able then to he can buy us some beer. And this white guy came, older white, he come and sat with us and said, can I buy you a beer? I said, oh, sure, you know. Anybody that wants to buy us beer, they're welcome in the table. So of course, you know, we have to ask him what he does. So I'm at the University of Saskatchewan, and I with the Native Studies department. So really, what do you teach? He said, oh, histories. So I'm writing a paper on Hunbaker and on some of the indigenous leaders, and of course, they that was his great grandfather. Name was the late Austin Tutusis, and the other one. And they said, "Oh, yeah, we're very interested. What exactly did?" Well, I said, I'm writing a paper on the disloyalty to the crown that they perpetuated. They said disloyalty to the crown. People wonder, what is that? What is that? And I could see my brother's bristles come up. He said, just wait here. He says, I want you to come and talk to my dad is just sitting out here. And I said, I want him and that other elder that sitting to come and listen to what you're researching about what you expect to find. So that's what happened. And he said, hey, I'll buy you some more beer or something. Go ahead, that'll be good. Number 4. So he repeated his research thing with the elders that were sitting there now. And boy, you could tell it just going to erupt into a darn good meeting so he started. Next thing you know, I'm looking around, and there's a table of about 40 people that are sitting around that same table, listening to the engagement, with about another 20 tables on the marginal, listening in. So it turned into an educational forum in the barroom set for reconciliation, and looking at it, indigenous perspective. And of course, everybody that was there, were buying beer and sending it to our table, so we ended up with more than we can.
That's all. Sometimes that's the best way, right? And that's, even going back to the one question of, how to, find an elder or, have those conversations, sometimes it is over a beer, over a coffee, like it's the conversation. So such a good learning opportunity.
That's right. They use both informal and formal ways of doing it. Yes.
Absolutely. So we just do have one more question here. Just wondering if you could speak on the inclusion of Indigenous languages in museums. So maybe perhaps they're asking, is that something that should be seen more? Should more things be translated? Again, we're speaking of the, cross education. Have you experienced, lack of, or would interpret that this should, be seen more? Is that something you could speak on?
Well, I think a basic orientation would be good. And if it could be done in the language of communities, the language group, and then you just have a basic Cree orientation. That would be part of object for whatever you may be looking at. Okay? But it's important as well to tell the people that are there, if they're Indigenous people, this is what you're able to acquire through these ceremonies, through the teachings. I was at the Sundance ceremony just 4 days ago, and that provided a really good forum, providing almost university level Cree knowledge, teachings, education, and ways in our own language to be able for all the people that are participating. That is really where it belongs. We don't bring it into mainstream institutions, but we can help facilitate and direct them toward those ways that are much more appropriate and relevant and be very useful.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank you again for your invaluable insight and for joining us here today. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. Is there anything else you wanted to end on here, Elder Fiddler, or you've had enough talking for the day?
It's a darn good thing I stopped drinking 47 years ago. Otherwise, I'd ask you to buy me around.
Maybe a tea or coffee, right? Yeah. Perfect. No, I want to thank you again for taking the time to share with us today. Like I said, your insight is invaluable. We appreciate everything that we can learn as we move forward. I would also like to thank the SAS for hosting Elder Fiddler. And on that note, I will say I want to thank you everyone for joining us today. We will make this available on our YouTube for viewing as well as transcriptions. So again, let's see. Yeah, we've just got a lot of thank yous here. So again, great appreciation and a pleasure meeting you, even virtually. Thank you again.